You can tell X-Men Apocalypse is set in 1983 because of Jean's giant shoulder pads. But also because, about halfway through, she, Scott, Jubilee, and Nightcrawler all cut class to go see Return of the Jedi in a proper theater. As they exit, they begin the great old nerd debate over which piece of the original Holy Trilogy is in fact the best. Jubes favors Empire because she's always been the spirit of her age. Scott, the future team leader and unreconstructed teacher's pet, favors the original, without which none of this would exist. Jean, the eternal peacemaker, when she's not being possessed by one of the fundamental creative forces of the universe, buttons up the whole scene by saying, at least we can all agree the third one is the worst. And okay, number one, that's really fucking rich coming from a Bryan Singer movie. I don't remember anybody twisting your arm and forcing you off a Last Stand, Brian. What? Did the WB flood your house with agents of the Matrix? Did they put a gun to your dog's head and say, make us the worst Superman movie ever, or the puppy gets it? Is that the story we're telling now? Because if it is, I've got like 6 bridges to sell you. And number two, no, we cannot all agree, Sansa Jean. It's just that so few of us have the time or the patience to argue such things. Most of us recognize, even if only on an unconscious level, that statements like the third one's always the worst are statements of faith, and that any ensuing arguments about them will not in any way, shape, or form be rational or productive. Nobody wants to be an ecumenical scholar these days. The pay is lousy, and everybody thinks your attempts at nuance are just knee-jerk contrarian assholery. Like this. Personally, I've never understood the hate Return of the Jedi gets. Yeah, I know, these days everybody just says Ewoks and leaves it at that. But you know what? Fuck y'all. Ewoks are awesome. Reading contemporary reviews, you find that most of the hate Jedi got in its time came from OG Star Wars haters, who, correctly, saw a horrible future in the original movie's success, and walked out of Jedi having pretty much the same thought I had years later walking out of Revenge of the Sith. Well, at least that's over with. Finally. Now we can all get on with our lives. Part of me wants to go back in time, give them all hugs, and pats on the head, and say something like, oh, my sweet summer child. The rest of me wants to just straight up tell them about this horrible future, because I've noticed that most of the OG Star Wars haters were conservative shitheads, with massive sticks jammed so far up their asses that even the Lord Impaler himself would go, damn. And I gotta admit, history is on Sansa Jean's side, at least from her temporal perspective. If I were there, I might say something like, well, what about Goldfinger? Or The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly? And she could just as easily hit me back with, well, what about Son of Frankenstein? Or Dracula, Prince of Darkness? Or The Creature Walks Among Us? Or Jaws 3, which is literally playing right the hell over there. Most of my good counterexamples, like Last Crusade, Dream Warriors, and Back to the Future 3, would still be in Sansa Jean's future. And hell, Temple of Doom and Nightmare on Elm Street 1 won't even be out for another year. And Back to the Future 1 won't even be out until a year after that. So I'm inclined to cut her some slack. You, cutting a hot redhead slack. And a Jean Grey, no less. I'm shocked. This is my shocked face. Except to say that if you're leaving your first viewing of Return of the Jedi with dry eyes and a stable voice, able to have a rational conversation about its place in the emerging nerd canon, then you should probably check your pulse. Because you're either dead or dead inside. Which is honestly worse. Like these X-Men films. I didn't enjoy the previous X-Men movie, Days of Future Past, as much as some people. To my mind, Days of Future Past went the long way around the barn to reboot this franchise. Something that Matthew Vaughn already did perfectly well 3 years prior with First Class. Days of Future Past was a grand exercise in lily gilding, falling prey to all of the series' worst inclinations. The sidelining of everything to make room for more Wolverine. The stunt casting of great actors who were given fuck all to do. I mean, again, why the hell cast Ellen Page as Kitty Pryde and then stick her in a room the whole fucking movie? I mean, at least Peter Dinklage gets to go places. And the reduction of a historical disaster to a cool backdrop for the punch-em-up climax. But some were able to look past all of that and see a hopeful, uplifting story about Charles Xavier accepting his destiny. With a little help from his future self. And Wolverine, of course. And what can you do except shrug and go, good for you, bub. Me, I'm basking in the glow of being right. And being told I was right by the film itself. When we catch up to Professor X here, he's pulling a choice quote out of T.H. White's 1958 King Arthur novel, The Once and Future King. You might remember this as the book Magneto was reading back in his plastic prison in X2. And various comic books over the years have cemented it as one of Charles's problematic faves. Let us now start fresh, without remembrance, Charles quotes to his students, rather than live forward and backward at the same time. In the context of King Arthur's Britain, that quote means, let's all stop fighting each other before the dark age that Merlin keeps ranting about swallows us all. In the context of these X-Men movies, it means the same thing as the last line in MST3K's theme song. Then repeat to yourself, it's just a show. I should really just relax. The cosmic reset button has been pressed. And all the continuity questions that have bedeviled us fans ever since X-Men Origins Wolverine told an origin story that didn't need to be told, since the whole point of X2 was that it didn't actually matter, are now officially null and void. We're in a new continuity here, people, with a new fresh-faced cast. And we're about to see a new story of how the X-Men came together to save the world that hates and fears them from an existential threat. You know, like the one Matthew Vaughn already told in 2011 when he made First Class. Of course, if you are still trying to make sense of this continuity, you'll drive yourself even more insane than I am. It's hard enough just to keep track of things from one movie to the next. Hey, remember Days of Future Past's cliffhanger ending? When it looked like Mystique had replaced the once and future Colonel Stryker? Remember its after the credits teaser? Oh, no you don't. Stop lying. Lies make baby Deadpool cry. And anyway, this movie certainly hopes you don't, because they got a name actor to play the villain after they shot that. So back in 3600 BCE, the mutant In Saba Nur managed to convince everyone in what was then Lower Egypt, because it's downhill from everything that's south of it, that he was God incarnate. Mostly by transferring his consciousness into the bodies of other mutants and stacking up their powers like Pokemon. Those who weren't convinced of his godhood rebelled against him and managed to bury him sort of alive, sort of not, until 1983, when he's awakened by a bunch of worshippers? I mean, they all conveniently die as he comes back to life, and we never hear about them, or whatever organization they may or may not have come from, so yeah. What's important is, the whole cast seems to feel his awakening, either through their own innate psychic powers, like Jean, their own super scientific instruments, like Hank McCoy, or through earthquakes that somehow send shockwaves all the way from Cairo to Poland, like Magneto. Speaking of which, our Magneto begins the movie with a whole new happy family to lose, so that he can get set right back to his default supervillain setting. Oh, what? You thought you saw him go through 2 whole movies worth of character development? Silly rabbit. Catch Eric in the wrong mood, and he'll totally join up with your vague, megalomaniacal plan to wipe out human civilization. Yes, he did push a coin all the way through Kevin Bacon's head in order to stop just such a plan not 2 movies ago, and that was awesome, but apparently we're not supposed to remember that either. If we did, we might start to think about how Kevin Bacon's plan to bring about the apocalypse by causing the Cuban Missile Crisis made a hell of a lot more sense than Apocalypse's plan to cause the apocalypse by... what even is Apocalypse's plan? This movie's so overstuffed, and the plan changes from act to act, so I forgive you for not getting it. In Act 1, his plan seems to be recruit an army of mutants to my cause by enhancing their powers. Then he hears about Magneto's no-good, very bad day with Communist Poland's public security forces, and the plan becomes recruit Magneto and get him to fuck with the Earth's magnetic field until human civilization is reduced to flying debris. Pretty sure that was the plot of one of the really bad Ultimates comics from the mid-2000s. Magneto's curiously silent about the undeniable fact this'll kill any mutant who isn't agile enough to dodge a planet's worth of flying debris, but then Apocalypse overhears Charles try to give Eric some telepathic grief counseling, and his plan becomes put my brain in Charles Xavier's body, gain his massive mind control powers, and use them to just make everybody think I'm a god again. But also the Magneto thing at the same time. Yes, the Magneto thing will significantly reduce the amount of minds available to control, but again, consistency for suckers. This is a corporate franchise superhero film. We need a giant, spectacular 30-minute climax to distract from the fact that the rest of this movie is pretty fucking pointless. Even by X-Men movie standards. Yes, if Apocalypse had any sense, he would have used his brief contact with Cerebro to get the nations of the Cold War to shoot at each other, rather than shoot all of their nukes into space, so that they can't be directed at him. But that's easy for me to say. I'm used to an Apocalypse who plays the long game, and whose convoluted plots are usually very much tied up with, or formulated in response to, the once-and-future Grey Summers dynasty. They could have done that here, since we have a new Cyclops and a new Jean to lash to Destiny's wheel, and to each other, whether they like it or not. Honestly, they seem to have a lot more chemistry than the last Scott and Jean we saw, though that could just be a factor of them no longer being vertexes of a love triangle. And anyway, if we made the movie about them, we couldn't make the movie about turning Magneto into the angry, sad villain everybody knows and apparently loves. His righteous rage, it's just so much more darn relatable than Apocalypse's cold, distant god complex. Begging the question, why have Apocalypse in this movie at all? Except he needs to be here for the same reason Magneto needs to be his fourth horseman. And the same reason Storm and Angel are here relegated to his first and third. Why not have recognizable characters henching for your bland, world-conquering one-off villain? Who cares? Only nerds. And we're gonna show up anyway, because, hey nerds, look, there's Psylocke in her comic-accurate costume. They were gonna give her something more aesthetically in line with the rest of the Apocalypse squad, but apparently Olivia Munn took one look at it and said, nope. Either it's a purple onesie or I walk. And kudos to her. But, again, remember that bit I said about casting good actors and giving them fuck all to do? Turns out it doesn't really matter whether Psylocke's here or not. Barely matters that Storm and Angel are here. Turns out brand recognition is way more important to our corporate masters and their employees than actually utilizing these characters for anything interesting. Hence this film, which we should all know by now, and which some of us even suspected at the time, not to brag or anything, is little more than a 2.5-hour setup for yet another Dark Phoenix movie. But let's take it seriously for a second as the third part of the First Class trilogy. Eric, Charles, and Raven's Excellent Adventures. First Class was mostly Eric's journey from angry young man to charismatic revolutionary. Logan's presence aside, DFOP was Charles Xavier's journey from total burnout, who'd lost all but one friend, to someone who could reasonably become the Charles Xavier we all met back in the year 2000, give or take a few decades of seasoning. This should be, by all rights, and it kind of is, Mystique's movie, the capstone of her circular journey all the way back around to Charles Xavier's point of view. Peaceful coexistence between mutants and humans is both good and possible, especially when it's backed up by the paramilitary strike force I keep hidden in the basement of my sweet mansion school, along with the warplane, and the machine that lets me read everyone's minds, and the giant robots. Did the Sentinels just wind up at Westchester's Army-Navy surplus store after the events of the last movie? Or did the Nixon administration actually let Charles keep them, the way the Gotham PD occasionally lets Batman take souvenirs home? I'm having a little trouble seeing, like, H.R. Haldeman or whoever going, "Yes, thank you for saving the president so he could resign in shame," like a year later, and basically ruin all of our careers. Yeah. Have some giant robots. Actually, yeah, I want to see that. Yeah, actually. Too bad Mystique's arc is truncated and rushed, just like everything else. She begins the film basically where Eric ended up at the end of First Class, minus Eric's righteously angry charisma. Her one tactical debate with Charles sounds a lot like the Charles and Eric debates of yore, despite the fact her being a bad enough dude to save the president on live TV has made her an international hero, especially to Charles's gifted youngsters. She's contemptuous of this until circumstances force her into the role, with Eric going full depressive nihilist again, Xavier kidnapped by Eric's new boss, and Beast relegated to glorified tech support, as is sadly usual by now. The role of team leader falls to Raven. Cyclops and Jean are too young anyway. The movie seems to remember this about halfway through. Let's see. What kind of jobber can we feed to these kids so we can show off how they were literally born for this? Asked for, he is found. And so, with the apocalypse quite literally looming, the movie takes a 20-minute break to have the whole cast extraordinarily renditioned out to everyone's apparently favorite X-Men movie location, Alkali Lake, by everyone's apparently favorite reoccurring X-Men villain, Colonel William Stryker. He has to be here, don't you know? If he weren't here, who could Scott and Jean possibly take down all by themselves? Apocalypse? Way to undermine your supposedly world-ending threat of a main villain. Not that they don't wind up doing that anyway. While this desperately wants to convince you it's the concluding chapter of one trilogy, it is also hyper-conscious of being the first act of X-Men, The Next Generation. I was going to call them all new and all different, but they're really not, since we met them all as adults 20 years ago. They're just slightly more interesting here, being so raw. But the relative ease with which they literally take the Weapon X program apart really undercuts the need for a team leader, even if she is played by J-Law. Speaking of third parts in X trilogies, there's a curious parallel here with Last Stand. In both movies, the X-Men's most physically powerful member, or former member, really, is turned into a more or less mindless engine of destruction, taking orders from the actual villain because it seems like something to do, and they really don't have anything else going on in their lives. Until they're talked into a moment of clarity by the designated main character in this so-called ensemble piece. Mystique doesn't kill Magneto the way Wolverine killed Jean, and that's actually kind of unfortunate. If she had, her character arc might be somewhere close to complete. And it would have been a nice parallel to that one bit in Days of Future Past where Magneto tried to kill her and only wound up making things worse. But that would have written Michael Fassbender out of the first franchise 20th Century Fox put on his shoulders. As well as upending the status quo this movie was clearly meant to establish. That's partially why, again, like Last Stand, the X-Men here actually do unite to face down a greater threat to all of humankind, be they standard issue or mutant. Xavier tells Apocalypse that he loses because he is fundamentally alone in his megalomania, while they are a fucked up modern family of foundlings, refugees, and frenemies. And if that had been some kind of overarching theme, then this movie just might have had a chance. But then again, I hear tell themes are for 8th grade book reports. Silly fucking HBO showrunners thinking 8th graders still have to do book reports. Fuck. The thing about Apocalypse is, he's always been an arrogant shithead, convinced of his own superiority and possessed by the kind of violent social Darwinism that movie Thanos couches in concern trolling about resource scarcity, because movie Thanos is fundamentally a coward. There are shades of that apocalyptic arrogance here, especially after Angel dies in a plane crash. Irony. Apocalypse takes one look at his corpse and pronounces it useless, prompting Storm to turn on him. But it's a blink and you'll miss it line in a movie full of them. Like the citizens of that other Apocalypse from that other comic book universe, our villain here doesn't do near enough evil speechifying to justify his name. Like Steppenwolf in Justice League, he gets maybe one good one in a 2.5-hour movie. And because he's using Xavier as a psychic megaphone at the time, so he can make his evil speech to the whole world, old Chuck just can't help himself but tack on an uplifting message to the end. I wish I could do the same, but honestly, I ran out of hope for these X movies back in, 2012-ish. The more time passes, the more First Class starts to look like a temporary reprieve from 2 decades of disappointment. No matter how much promise is inherent in these flicks' premises, casts, or production designs, something always seems to come along and fuck shit up. And this time, I think that something was named Fant Forstick. I don't have any proof of this, so this is pure speculation on my part, this bit here at the end. Since getting proof would require me to go to LA and start asking questions that I'm pretty sure nobody wants to answer. But the dates certainly line up. We know producer-writer Simon Kinberg spent most of 2014 and 15 balls deep in the Fant Forstick fiasco, desperately trying to either save the film from Josh Trank or conspiring to take it away from him, depending on whose story you believe. Either way, he must have known that Fant Forstick was about to leave a giant 4-shaped hole in Fox's balance sheet by April 2015, when this apocalypse started filming. Hey, remember the flurries of contradictory statements over whether or not the Fantastic Four existed in this X-universe? And you thought it was safe, remembers? The North remembers, no matter how many times Simon says forget. Nobody, except perhaps Ryan Reynolds knew Deadpool was going to be the smash hit it was until it came out. And even Wolverine's fans were leery of Logan until they saw it. So I suspect Kinberg and Singer and everyone else in the text wall of credited producers rushed this fucker out of the oven, literally half-baked, so they could all have a guaranteed win in their columns for fiscal quarter number 2 of 2016. There's a third way to read Sansa Jean's line about the third one's always the worst, and that's his preemptive damage control. Yeah, we know this one's not as good as the other two, but look, sometimes shit happens. That it does. But seems to keep happening to the X franchise. Almost like the creative team behind them has a serious case of burnout. And a just as serious case of professional typecasting. They are Fox's designated superhero people. Or they were, at any rate. And by this point, they'd been that for 16 very long years. And instead of bringing in new blood that they could have eventually passed the torch on to, they seem to have systematically alienated all of the younger directors who were once proud to sign up with them. Excited to be a part of their ongoing project. Which was, of course, the project that started this whole superhero boom in the first fucking place. The ones that proved that, yes, you could make a movie without Batman. And yes, it could make tons of money. With the Disney assimilation of Fox now complete, we can only wait and see what the future might bring. And grit our teeth through what we know it's going to bring next. Second verse, same as the first. Fox too cheap and too scared to do the Shi'ar Empire upright. So, we are once again skipping the actual Phoenix saga and going full dark, no stars. You know what? Fuck it. If you want a good X-Men show, live action, movie type thing, watch Doom Patrol. Best X-Men series in 15 years, say. When did Evolution end? Yeah, let's just say 15 years. Thanks for watching, everyone. If you liked this video, then click the like button and the subscribe button and the little bell and blah blah blah. But if you really liked this video, then consider supporting the show on Patreon. There you can join the ranks of the elite, such as Mr. Hootie Dean, Detective Steve, The After Movie Diner, and Stu G. Next time, back to the mid-2000s. I just had to get my X-Men on.